Thank you, Zimbabwe, for tuning into yet another informative edition of your program. This is Agricultural New Directions, Agribusiness in support of Vision 2030. Now, you would find that in our society today, everyone seems to be enjoying a slice of watermelons, which are being produced by our local farmers here in Zimbabwe. We are not importing watermelons. Our local producers here in Zimbabwe are producing these watermelons throughout the geographical locations of our country to ensure that each and every one of us has a tasty slice of watermelon, especially during this summer season where we have a lot of sunlight and extremely high heat units in our economy. Now, Zimbabwe, we encourage you to be a part of these conversations. I would like to believe that as we'll be talking, you'll be taking notes and understanding how watermelons are produced on a commercial basis for the market here in Zimbabwe. To discuss this and more, I've taken the liberty of inviting Francis Mapindani. He is an horticultural expert working with various farmers in our economy as Zimbabwe. Francis, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Waza. It's always a great opportunity for me to be on this show and engaging with our farmers.
Yes, today we want to look at commercial watermelons production. As we get into our discussion, Francis, maybe a brief background, a brief introduction of watermelon production in Zimbabwe.
Watermelon production is something which is still on the rise here in Zimbabwe, and I feel like I really love how everything is going, the movement that it's been having of late, because there's a lot of interest in watermelon production. I would feel like it's one of those crops which gives a high return on per each and every dollar invested here in Zimbabwe, and I would feel like it's really one crop which is a bit much more which has been a bit much more less accepted over the years, but lately it has been really moving in the right direction. It's an easy crop to grow, not many complications, especially when it comes to its growth. So it's actually one crop that our farmers, especially when they are targeting a crop which can give them a high return per dollar invested, it can actually come through as that. We're looking per each and every dollar invested, at least for every dollar that we invest in our crop, we're looking at probably a return of around probably $3 to even $4 for each and every dollar that we invest. And in the good seasons, you can even push that even up to 6, especially during the times when it's scarce, during the winter period here in the high veld. So one thing that we have noticed of late is that, as much as people were really a bit reluctant to grow them during the winter season, I feel like our fellow farmers in the low-lying areas, including the Chiredzes, the Muzarabanis, they have kind of grasped the importance of their location, because of late we've been seeing a lot of watermelon coming into Harare from Chiredze during the winter period, when a lot of people in the high veld can do that, because watermelon naturally is a frost-sensitive crop. It doesn't need any frost. So one thing that we'll notice, if you plant your seed directly into the soil, you actually notice that you have a challenge with its germination during the winter period, because it requires some warmer soil temperatures for it to germinate.
Okay, Francis, I want us to talk about the varieties that we have. Standing in this field, we have different colors. There is the darker shade, the one that is dark green, and the one that is maybe with lighter stripes. Talk to us in terms of the varieties that most of the Zimbabwean farmers are producing.
Okay, in Zimbabwe, one thing we can notice is that the most popular type of watermelon here in Zimbabwe is the Crimson Sweet type. The Crimson Sweet type is the watermelon that we have consumed, I think, for a lot of years, because the OPV, the openly pollinated variety of it, has been available in Zimbabwe for a very long time. It's a variety called Crimson Sweet. It's a variety that comes through with a uniformly deep green kind of rind, which is dominantly dark green with light green stripes. That's one thing that we can clearly notice with that watermelon, and it's much more rounder shaped when it comes to the shape of it. It's a watermelon that has been there because a lot of people actually love how great tasting it can be, because it's a watermelon that comes through with a deep red kind of rind inside. Yes. The deep red rind is the deep red flesh is something that our farmers want. The farmers want that, and also our consumers want that. So it's something that it has been popular for. But of late, though, there have been varieties that have been introduced on the market, which are the Jubilee types, that have a bit of what the opposite of what our Crimson Sweet type usually offers. It's a type that has a light green rind with some small dark green kind of like stripes that you can see there. So what our market sometimes, and also us as well, sometimes just call those, we usually call them the zebra type of watermelons. And these are the watermelons that we're standing in here to with Wadza. These are the watermelons that we have here, which are going to be showing something like this, which is prominently light green with light green stripes. So technically it's kind of like showing the zebra kind of pattern. Yeah, but of late though, we also have some of the Charleston grey type of watermelon, which is just dominantly light green. It's just purely light green without any stripes. And yeah, it's a variety that was popular back in the day because of the size, but now it's kind of like lost some traction. Then lastly, with a bit of some specialty varieties like the sugar baby kind of type of watermelons, which are just dominantly dark green. We say the Charleston grey is dominantly light green, right? This one is now dominantly just dark green.
Like the ones that I'm seeing next to you.
Exactly. Like just like those ones. Those are the type of watermelons that we have. Although those ones are not quite as popular, they're a bit more of a niche kind of like watermelon. So for some farmers who actually like that, they can actually get the sugar baby type.
Francis, as we round off this segment, I want us to look at issues surrounding irrigation. Watermelon, I'd like to believe 90, if not to 95% of it is mainly water, meaning it is a water-loving crop. Can you talk to us in terms of the efficient or effective irrigation system that a farmer can take advantage of so that he produces a good, attractive watermelon?
Okay, looking at where we are, probably I think maybe I might just connect it with our current weather situation in Zimbabwe. It hasn't been raining in a bit of a while, and something that worries our farmers. So looking at that from that perspective, I would feel like one of the most effective ways of irrigating our watermelon is just coming through with our drip irrigation. Drip irrigation comes through with water and just applying it directly into the rooting zone of our plant. So it's something that is not probably just putting a lot of water per square area. You're actually just making your water to actually go straight into your plant. So the first thing that I would actually like, the first mode of irrigation that I would like would be the drip irrigation, just because of its efficiency. And also another beautiful thing that it offers, it doesn't wet the foliage. The foliage most of the leaves are not, it doesn't wet the leaves. Wetting the leaves usually brings about a challenge where we might put our crop into a bit of a place where it's quite susceptible to fungal infections that can affect the leaves. And we have some diseases that affect our watermelons, which include the powdery mildews, even downy mildew, and those are diseases that kind of come through as well and affect our crop. And we can even include the angular leaf spot as well.
Okay, now Francis, I'm going to have to cut you short because we're going to go on a short commercial break. I want you to talk about diseases and maybe how they are attached to the mode of irrigation when we come after the break.
Lovely.
On that note, viewers, we've come to the end of the first segment. We're going to go on a short commercial break. We'll be right back with this and more on commercial watermelon production. Stay tuned. Thank you, farmers and aspiring farmers, for staying tuned to Agricultural New Directions, Agribusiness, in support of Vision 2030. This is where we equip each other with business fundamentals when it comes to agricultural enterprises. We look at business finance, time value of money, production economics, in this case, commercial watermelon production here in Zimbabwe. Now, viewers, we encourage you to be a part of these conversations. Feel free to get in touch with the producer, Wadzanai Manyore, on 0772-807-506. Alternatively, you can like our Facebook page, Agribusiness with Wadzanai. Make a follow-up on this episode and more, and leave your comments and suggestions on our YouTube channel, Agribusiness with Wadzanai. We are also now available on X, formerly known as Twitter. It's at Agribusiness 110. Now, earlier on, before into the break, Francis here was talking to us in terms of the mode of irrigation that is efficient and effective when it comes to commercial watermelons production. Francis, we are here in the second segment. Welcome back.
Thank you, Wadza.
Yes, I want you to align the mode of irrigation and how it is related sometimes to the spread of diseases and the types of insect pests that can thrive as a result of maybe irrigation, maybe flood irrigation, overhead irrigation, or drip irrigation. What are we looking at?
Thank you so much, Waza. So just like what we were mentioning in the previous segment, there are some methods that are actually a bit much more easier on our watermelon crop in terms of the disease prevalence that it can have, especially when we apply a certain water irrigation method. So the first one that I had mentioned, which is usually just my favorite, is the drip irrigation, because it doesn't wet our foliage. Yes. The water is just going straight into the rooting zone of our plant, which actually just ensures that our plant is getting all the water that it's wanting, but also not getting its leaves getting to be a little bit wet. Because one of those things, one of the problems that it actually brings is usually just brings out the prevalence in diseases that can affect these crops. Especially if we look at watermelon, we can see that it's kind of like a dense crop.
Okay.
It's a dense crop, and one problem that it might have is that that kind of the moisture remains held up right within the leaves, so that during the rainy season, during the even the current season that we're in, we might have a challenge where the moisture might be there for a bit longer, and it might actually just get to encourage some diseases that can affect our crop. So it's always very necessary for us to try an irrigation method which is less which has a less chance of wetting our leaves. But we cannot ignore that some of our farmers don't have some of those structures, and sometimes they just have some structures that actually just come through and are a bit much more easier and much more economic for them, like overhead irrigation. Sometimes it's a bit much more cheaper for our farmers.
Okay.
So yeah, we have to bring that. But one thing that we obviously have to try to come through with is obviously trying to make sure that we adhere to our fungicidal programs, especially when it comes to this watermelons. We're trying to prevent the powdery mildew, we're trying to prevent downy mildew, we're trying to prevent even angular leaf spot as well. Those are kind of like some diseases that affect our watermelon. So it's very necessary for us to come through with some fungicides that can try to prevent some of those diseases. We're looking at fungicides, preventative fungicides, which might include copper oxychloride, which might include mancozeb, which might include chlorothalonil, also known as Bravo.
Yes.
Those are things, those are chemicals that we can actually just try to make sure that each and every week we are bringing in, just to make sure that our crop stays protected. So it's very necessary for us to adhere to that. But once we start noticing some disease symptoms, just like what you had asked, you had asked about some chemicals that our farmers can try to use to mitigate some of these diseases that I had mentioned. We can bring in some chemicals that can deal with even the mildews. We can deal with the powdery mildew by just coming through. Once we start noticing it, we can bring in chemicals like wettable sulfur, which can come through and protect that. And also, if we actually have some much more rabid diseases that are going through into our crop, like the angular leaf spot, once it starts attacking, we might actually just bring preventative fungicides, which might include chemicals like Amistatop, which might include chemicals like Tevconazole as well. They are chemicals that can come through and try to alleviate the disease that's actually affecting our crop. So it's very necessary for our farmers to try to look at it from that angle to make sure that it happens like that.
Now, Francis, I want us to look at the fertilizer that is used and to apply in watermelons production. Some farmers do opt for synthetic fertilizers, whilst others use organic manure to produce their watermelons. Can you talk to our audience there at home in terms of the soil type, maybe the soil pH that is conducive for watermelons production, including the fertilizers that you can come with, or even the organic matter, or even the supplements? Some use foliar fertilizers to support their cropping ventures. Talk to us in terms of that.
Okay, so the first thing that we have to notice, especially when we want to do our watermelons, is to try to look into the is obviously just to start off with in the right way. And usually the right way for us is obviously just to get our soils tested. On top of it is just getting the right seed. We can obviously just come through and we can try to just get our soils tested so that we start off our agronomic practices in the right way. So the first thing that we have to do is to try to get our pH. pHs that are usually quite okay for our watermelons. We're looking at a range that hovers between 5.5 to around 6 on the pH scale. That's a very, very good range for our watermelons to grow in. If our pH is quite lower, then definitely we need to come through and lime our soils so that we can raise up the pH and it gets into the range that that our watermelons will thrive definitely under. Once we do that, then we can just come through with everything else. Watermelons usually are quite more demanding, especially when it comes to calcium. Because the fruit quality is usually something that is improved by applying calcium into our crop as well. So we can actually just bring usually some lime like calcitic lime that can actually come through and supply the calcium that's needed by our watermelons, and also the liming effect that is going to have to just raise up our pH. So that's one thing that we can try to look at. And once everything is done, we usually just have some general recommendations that we can give our farmers, although one of the things that we consider quite at the top is obviously just to let your fertilizer program be dictated by your soil test results, so that you definitely know the elements that are lacking in your soil and the elements that are quite prevalent in your soil. So it's necessary for us to try to look into that. But in general though, we can always just recommend our farmers to come through with the tobacco bulk blend, which is usually the 628-23 fertilizer that actually just works quite so well for our watermelons.
Watermelons.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we can actually just bring that as our basal fertilizer. And another thing that we have noticed that actually works quite well is just combining that with the organic kind
Manure.
of fertilizers that we're looking
Okay.
at. We're looking at the manure coming through. Manure kind of like comes through and it improves our soil, but also supplies the elements that we need for our watermelon to perform quite so well. So we need that. We can combine the basal and we can combine it. We can combine the basal with our manure, and that will work great.
Okay, thank you so much, Francis. I like the emphasis on improving fruit quality through the use of fertilizers that are conducive to support growth and development, so that at the end of the day, the farmer makes profits when he sends his watermelons to the market. On that note, viewers, we've come to the end of the second segment. We're going to go on a short commercial break. We'll be right back with this and more in the third and final segment. Stay tuned. Thank you, Zimbabwe, for staying tuned to Agricultural New Directions, Agribusiness in support of Vision 2030. Now, viewers, we are here in the third and final segment where we were looking at our commercial watermelons production. Earlier on, before into the break, Francis here was telling us on how to maintain quality through the use of fertilizers and proper application techniques and systems. We are here in the third and final segment. Welcome back.
Thank you, Ada.
As we get into this final segment, Francis, I want us to look at the plant population which a hectare can support. How many units of watermelons can be produced within 1 hectare? And also, what are we looking at in terms of yield, in terms of tonnage per hectare? Looking at even maybe what is the size of an acceptable watermelon in terms of kilograms? What are we looking at?
Okay, Waza. So one thing that we can notice, probably we might start off with the number of plants that you can fit in per hectare. For watermelon, we're usually working with a range that hovers between 6 to around 8,000 plants per hectare, making sure that we kind of space it apart. Because one thing that we have noticed about watermelons, they really demand their space for them to actually get to vine freely. Getting to vine freely actually ensures that you get more successful flowers that you can get per each and every plant. Because, yeah, some studies have shown that as the plant kind of like continues, as the plant vines continue to kind of grow and get a bit longer, if they get in contact with the next one, sometimes they actually get to reduce that, and sometimes they might even get to abort some of the fruits which will be close to the edges of the vine. So it's actually one thing that is necessary for us to give our watermelons some space so that at least they can vine freely. So once we do that, one thing that we can notice is that per each and every plant, we might get fruit numbers that can hover between around 2 to 3 fruits per plant. Depending on the variety, the sizes might differ. But with the hybrids, usually with the Jubilee types, one thing we notice is that the kind of like the weights can hover close to around between 10 to 12 kgs of in terms of weight per each and every watermelon. So that actually gives us quite a lot. So we can hover up to around 100 tons of watermelons, between 80 to 100 tons of watermelons per hectare. So that's one way that we can notice it. So if we actually look at it that way, depending on the time that we grow the watermelons, that can actually be a very good breakout for our farmers, especially who are actually looking for the success that they want from their watermelons.
Okay, Francis, looking at days to maturity, what are we looking at? From when you establish your watermelons, you've done your proper agronomic practices, now we are headed towards harvesting. Days to maturity, what are we looking at? And their variances maybe from one variety to another.
Okay, so usually the range hovers between around 75, being the earliest, and we can actually get the longer ones approaching the 95 to 100 day kind of range. But when we're counting our days of our watermelons, we're not counting from the day that we actually see our germination. We're counting from the day that we start noticing the 2 true leaves appearing on our watermelon.
Okay.
The 2 true leaves are the ones that we actually start counting with. So we don't actually start counting from the day that we actually plant our seed. We're actually looking from the 2 true leaf stage. So usually the quantities, the number of days that I've talked about, there are a number of days that are ranging from the 2 true leaf stage. So from the moment that we start noticing that to the moment that we actually start harvesting, that can usually hover between 75 to around 90 days per in terms of the days to maturity. And obviously it depends with the variety, but usually the hybrids are a bit much more quicker than the OPV varieties.
Finally, Francis, looking at the market, before you go on to the market, you have to harvest your produce and maybe store it and maybe look at issues surrounding the shelf life and how to curb post-harvest losses. At times, the farmer might get it right through his agronomic practices, but when it comes to harvesting or curbing those losses, we might having maybe at times watermelon that decays in the field, that rots in the field, some that splits in the field, some that is damaged during storage. Can you talk to us in terms of curbing issues surrounding post-harvest losses and even how you can ensure that your watermelon has a longer shelf life ahead of marketing?
Okay, thank you so much, Waza. So on the harvesting part, one of the things that we can notice, especially with our watermelon, is that we have to try by all means to harvest it with the stalk still on.
Okay.
So that we don't make sure that we don't leave any wound on the part of the plant where the stalk was holding on to. So we have to make sure that when we are harvesting, we leave the stalk on so that we don't leave any inlet for infection into our watermelon. That way, we can actually maybe push up the days its shelf life by close to even more than 2 weeks even under storage. But one thing that we have to obviously try to look at is that most of these crops, they usually demand a cool, dark, dry place as well for them to actually last longer. So we have to make sure that we store them in a place which is a bit cooler, in a place which is dry, and in a place as well which is well ventilated as well, just to make sure that we don't encourage any microbial action within the facility that we're storing these in. But if we do that, maybe the longest that we can actually keep some of our watermelons probably about close to around 3 weeks that we can keep some of these watermelons. So we can have to try by all means to make sure that we keep on checking on them and make sure that they are the best quality as possible for them to actually get to the market, because that's what we want at the end of the day. We want to send our watermelons in the best quality. So we have to make sure that we do that. And also another thing that our farmers can maybe try to look at when it comes to pushing their shelf life is to look on their fertilizers as well. It's usually encouraged not to put fertilizers that are high in nitrates during the flowering stage of our plant. So we have to make sure that we try to reduce those ones, because they have a high nitrogen within the plant has a tendency of reducing the plant's shelf, the fruit's shelf life. So it's very necessary for our farmers to try to monitor their fertilizer applications so that they don't put fertilizers that are high in nitrogen when the plant has reached the flowering stage, because this will kind of like come through and bite them in the back when their fruits start to rot a little bit quicker than they are supposed to. So that's one thing they have to look at.
Okay, Francis, finally, what does the market expect in terms of watermelons that they are purchasing? We have people that are purchasing as individuals, as families. Some supermarkets are looking to get their watermelons from farmers, or even the mass markets. We are looking at Mbari, we are looking at our Sakuva. What are the market expectations so that when our producers produce, they are in line with what the market demands and its requirements?
Okay. At this stage, I feel like, our farmers are a bit much more favored when it comes to watermelons, because most of the time the prices are usually dictated by the size of the watermelon.
Yes.
So I think our farmers are actually starting to benefit more from that. As much as it comes at a bit of a lesser price maybe for the smaller watermelons, we definitely know that the bigger ones are going to fetch a much more higher price.
Yes.
So it's something that our farmers have to look at. So both the formal and the informal market are actually helping our farmers quite a lot in terms of actually getting to push their watermelons into the market, because we don't get a lot of our farmers getting uniform prices for their products. So maybe you might actually notice that some farmers will be worried that their watermelon, even if it's bigger, it's going to fetch the same price as a smaller watermelon. No, they're actually going to differ in terms of pricing. So both the formal and the informal markets are very much more supportive on that. The informal market, it comes through and tries to look at more on the size of the watermelon, not much based on the weight though. Although technically it's based on weight, but they don't really get to actually get a watermelon and put it on a scale and maybe try to look at the metrics of that. We're just looking at the sizes, which are kind of like uniform, and just setting up a uniform price for that. But the formal ones, the supermarkets, the wholesalers, they actually get to put them on a scale and actually dictate a price, which is actually dictated on the price per kilo, which is something that defends our farmers sometimes as well. So it's very necessary for our farmers to look into that. But of late, one of the things that we've noticed, the Jubilee types are actually coming through as watermelons that are quite being favored by consumers as well. They're starting to know that these ones are great tasting as well, as much as the Crimson Sweet that they were used to getting in the past. So all the watermelons seem to be getting some good love and support at the moment, and our farmers can have a wide range of varieties that they can actually around play with, just looking at some of the attributes that they are looking at, which are usually the sizes and also the yield at the end of the day. That can be a good factor for our farmers. So let's make sure that we plant our watermelons, because I would feel like this is one of my favorite crops, and it gives a high return to our farmers.
Thank you so much, Francis, for such a detailed presentation.
Yeah.
You spoke thoroughly in terms of how to ensure that you are sending your product to the market, which is acceptable and in line with what farmers are looking for. And even those who consume will be happy with your product, whilst you also make profits from your venture. It was a pleasure having with us, our viewers, today. From me, your host, Zanai Manyore. I'm also on Instagram. It's a W Manyore. And the crew behind the scenes. Have yourselves a fabulous evening. Thank you for watching.